Is young Earth creationism irrational? Everyone loves to poke fun at young Earth creationism. In the minds of many atheists and Christians alike, adherents of this view are the epitome of irrationality, and confessing to such a belief gives you a one-way ticket to becoming an intellectual and academic pariah. Indeed, disavowing young Earth creationism is the best way to gain respectability, especially if you're a Christian. However, in my experience, those who laugh at young Earth creationism very rarely have any idea what creationists actually believe. The most common accusation is the one expressed here. You don't believe in dinosaurs, but you believe in an invisible enemy that planted their bones to fool you, and you wonder why we laugh at you. The only problem is that creationists believe no such thing. In this video, I would therefore like to set the record straight with an overview of what young Earth creationists really believe. The main evidence of the past history of the Earth is the geological record, particularly the miles-thick layers of sedimentary rocks, called sedimentary layers, that exist all over the world. The evolutionary interpretation of these layers, that we all learn in school, is called uniformitarianism. This is the belief that the layers built up gradually over many millions of years, so that the deeper you dig, the older the rocks are. However, prior to Darwinism, the main approach to geology taught at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, etc. was catastrophism. That is, the idea that the sedimentary layers that cover much of the Earth's surface were formed by one or more global catastrophe. In the 6th chapter of Genesis, Moses describes a global catastrophe in which the whole topography of the Earth was transformed by a violent global flood involving major tectonic and volcanic activity. This former understanding of geology, therefore, enabled a harmony between science and the Judeo-Christian religion that dominated Western thought. However, this harmony was shattered when Darwin's friend and mentor Charles Lyell, who had an intense dislike of the Bible, worked tirelessly to divorce geology from its marriage to the Mosaic view of Earth history. In 1830, Lyell published his Principles of Geology, which was, as its subtitle explains, an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. Basically, the idea is that everything we observe in the geological column can be explained by gradual processes that we can observe operating in the world today. Lyell and his followers devised a scheme for understanding the various levels of strata as a series of geological ages, such as the Cambrian and the Jurassic and the Miocene, etc., each of which were understood to have lasted millions or billions of years. In addition to these geological ages, more recent eras of prehistory were divided into theoretical eras of gradual human development from ape-like ancestors, such as the Neolithic and Paleolithic ages, or more commonly the Stone Age, Iron Age, Bronze Age, etc. This Darwinian Lyellian conception of history is now so embedded in our psyches that whenever we see exposed rock strata on a cliff, we automatically think of millions of years. However, while catastrophism was pretty much dead for 140 years, in the 1960s, an American hydraulic engineer by the name of Henry Morris brought it back from the grave. As a professor of hydrogeology, Morris was in a good position to look at the sedimentary layers with fresh eyes and reconsider the Genesis flood as a possible explanation. Morris understood that in moving water, many layers of horizontal sediment can be laid down extremely rapidly and simultaneously, rather than being gradually deposited one layer at a time. In 1961, Morris published his immensely influential book, The Genesis Flood, a book that Stephen Jay Gould called the founding document of the modern creationist movement. In this book, Morris makes the bold claim that almost all of the sedimentary rocks of the Earth, which are the ones containing fossils, and from which the supposed geological history of the Earth has been largely deduced, have been laid down by moving waters. Exactly the sort of thing which occurs in any flood, and which we have seen must have occurred on a uniquely grand scale during the Great Flood of Genesis. It's a hell of a coincidence that the Bible contains an account of an event that could conceivably have created the sedimentary layers. Without this, Christians would have no explanation at all for where the layers came from. But is there really evidence that the layers were laid down quickly? Creationists point to the fact that there is virtually no evidence of time between each layer. If each boundary was the surface of the ground for millions of years before the next layer formed, we would expect to find root systems, animal burrows, and rivers. Yet the boundaries are almost completely flat, indicating that they were deposited very quickly. Biologist and paleontologist Dr. Arthur Chadwick has spent many years investigating this phenomenon.
When you look at the rocks themselves, you don't see evidence for the passage of a lot of time. And Dr. Brandon and I have been working on this for the last 15 years, just going through tens of thousands of meters of sediment, looking for evidence of the passage of time between the layers. And the evidence would be that the layers have been disrupted or resuspended or moved around by organisms or roots or whatever processes. Once you deposit a layer, if it's just sitting there for a year, say nothing of 100 years or 1,000 years, that layer is going to be affected by its environment.
So in the current process today, if we have some sediment that gets laid down, what you're saying is that there are processes going on that would radically change that layer.
Sure. Roots penetrate soil and move it around. Organisms, if it's, well, even above sea level, but below sea level, you have worms that live all over the bottom and other organisms, and they're burrowing constantly in the sediment. That's where they get their food. And so if you bring in a new supply of food for them, they're going to devour that, and they're going to mess up all the internal structure. So we look at these layers and we say, is the internal structure still there, or has it been disrupted by organisms, which equals time? Not a lot of time necessarily, but time. If you see no disruption, then you're going to have a hard time explaining that sediment in a long period of time.
And what did you find down in the fossil
We
records?
found tens of thousands of meters with no disruption whatsoever. One layer after layer after layer after layer. And we were looking at it in a centimeter scale. We were walking through thousands of meters of sediment, looking at centimeter level disruptions, and they're very difficult to find. You can find them once in a while, but not the kind that we would expect if there'd been the passage of a lot of time.
The fossils themselves also exhibit much evidence of rapid catastrophic burial. Normally, when animals die, their bodies are consumed and disintegrate in a few years, yet all over the world there are massive fossil graveyards containing millions of well-preserved land creatures alongside sea creatures. Furthermore, many of the sedimentary layers are well above sea level, indicating that the continents were once covered in water. Indeed, fossils of sea creatures are found on even the highest mountains. Here is Dr. Chadwick explaining why he believes the fossil record is best explained by a global flood.
This certainly is what's called a fossil graveyard. It's a place where many hundreds or thousands of dinosaurs or animals died. They didn't die where they are because I think we've discussed already they were transported to where we find them. But they died somewhere, and they were catastrophically killed. They all died about the same time because the bones are all in about the same shape. And so we have this massive number of bones, and there had to be some event that was significant enough to kill that many animals all at once. So that certainly brings up the idea of a global catastrophic process. Bone beds that we find in the fossil record are really much more pervasive and extensive than they are today. You can get a bone bed if you have, for example, a catastrophic flood and it covers an area where people and animals live. Then if you came back years later, you'd find some bones there, but you wouldn't find anything like the scale that we find in the fossil record. When you find a bone bed like these, and there are many of these in the Cretaceous, it certainly pushes you to the conclusion that there was a major catastrophic process going on. This is not just life as usual.
Right.
The real creationist view, then, is that the sedimentary layers were laid down suddenly and catastrophically by a global cataclysm that flooded the continents. And if we take off our evolutionary goggles, then the evidence looks remarkably consistent with this.
And we find evidence for this in the direction of currents that are flowing over the surface of the Earth. For example, in the rocks, if you've ever seen cross-bedded sandstone, it's sandstone that lies at an angle like this. That sandstone tells us which direction the current was moving that deposited that sand. If we look at these flow of currents over the surface of the Earth and in all these different layers of rock, from the Cambrian all the way up to the top, we find out that it seems to be going the same way over wide areas of the Earth. Like there's some kind of flow taking place that's different from anything we have today. Today we have a basin, the sediments go into that basin from all sides, and we would see evidence of currents flowing into that basin. In the fossil record, what we see is the currents tend to ignore the basins. They tend to go right across the basins, and they tend to be looking at something much bigger than just a part of North America, for example. And in fact, the currents in North America and South America behave the same way, just to give you one example. So that to me suggests that in the development of the fossil record, we had processes going on that were bigger than anything we can imagine today. It doesn't say today's processes continued over a long period of time would have produced this. It says the only reasonable way to produce this is to have processes that are not going on the Earth today.
It is true that some dating methods, such as radiometric dating, give dates in the millions of years for the layers. However, other evidence points to recent catastrophic formation. For example, carbon-14 should disappear from organisms in under 50,000 years, yet all the fossils in all the layers contain carbon-14. Furthermore, in 2013, a number of dinosaur bones were discovered that are unfossilized and contain stretchy blood vessels and blood cells.
Well, North Carolina State University professor Mary Schweitzer is the leader of the discovery team that found these extraordinary specimens. She joins us now from Raleigh with more. Nice to see you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us, how significant a discovery is this?
Well, it has the potential to be very significant, but for right now, until we do further analyses, I think all we can say is it's really cool.
Is that amazing to find this kind of soft tissue in a fossil this old? And what can the soft tissue really tell us?
Well, it's very amazing. It's utterly shocking, actually, because it flies in the face of everything that we understand about how tissues and cells degrade. It's not something that any one of us could ever predict or hope for. And I think that it's important to remember that we don't know for sure what it still is. It looks like blood vessels, and it looks like bone matrix, and it certainly looks like cells, and it acts like cells. But we haven't done the chemical analysis that let us say what it is for sure.
So as a microbiologist, when you look at this, the two major paradigms that we have before us, and even though this is surprising, there is a paradigm between these two that better fits the evidence than the other.
I think we understand enough about the process and enough about tissue itself to recognize that the more clear, parsimonious, if you will, the simplest explanation is simply that the fossils aren't as old as they're being claimed to be. And so that clearly, this is in violation of the dating process. It challenges the entire dating process. If the fossils of dinosaurs have been dated incorrectly, which I would say this is clear evidence they have, then it's very likely the fossils of any organism have been dated incorrectly, and therefore then the geologic ages themselves are incorrect. And we have to go back and recognize that they use evolution as their control, if you will. It's the filter. If I don't get a date that fits what evolution expects, then the date is rejected. It doesn't make a difference what the date is. It doesn't make a difference how you came about getting the date if it doesn't fit the filter of evolution, if it doesn't fit what we need. If you have something that's out of the Jurassic, but it's dated at 300 million years, that can't be right. Therefore, it's automatically tossed out. Why can't it be right? Because we have, in the evolutionary assumptions, determined that organisms that lived during the period of the Jurassic are this old. And so it sets then the interpretation for everything. When you have problems like the soft tissue, see, you either have to reject the entire dating process or you have to reject the soft tissue. You know, you really can't have both. They're trying to have both, but it clearly is one or the other. Either the fossils aren't as old as we think they are, or there's some mysterious, unknown, magical process that preserves them. Well, which is more scientific? What we know today, the tissue can't last that long, therefore the fossils can't be that old, regardless of what other dating methods you claim you've used.
Far from being irrational then, modern flood geologists, like the catastrophist founders of geology, base their interpretation of the geological record on observations in the field, that is, on empirical data, as even Stephen Jay Gould, ever the honest evolutionist, has admitted. Lyell relied on true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. The geologic record does seem to require catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted, whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposed his imagination on the evidence. The geologic record, he argued, is extremely imperfect, and we must interpolate into it what we can reasonably infer but cannot see. The catastrophists were the hard-nosed empiricists of the day, not the blinded theological apologists. Young Earth creationism, then, is not nearly as irrational as is commonly claimed. The Great Flood is an event that exists in the collective memories of nearly every culture on Earth, but is most clearly recorded in the Bible. If this event occurred, then we would expect to find the continents of the Earth covered in sedimentary layers, filled with the remains of the millions of creatures that perished in the Great Flood. And this is exactly what we do find. Rather than dismissing young Earth creationism as irrational, I therefore suggest that atheists take it a bit more seriously if they're going to prove it to be false. This is Dan Stone, the Rational Creationist. Don't forget to subscribe, and please see my website swallowingtheredpill.com for more information.